quotation from the title of my presentation comes from a letter to Emile, in which he's talking about buying a notebook, essentially. But I'd really like to think of this really as a metaphor for his own personal transformation. So, as Arthur Hoyle and Eric Lehman today have talked about various challenges that Miller was trying to position himself against and resist and so forth. That's where I'm going to be starting, right? In terms of how a person can wake up one morning and find themselves trapped in a situation that they didn't plan on, they didn't devise, they didn't like, and how does one break out of that, if one can break out of that? As you all know, Miller was famously against isms and ideologies, and thus many of the correctives for capitalism that were popular when he was younger did also not appeal to him in a particular way. Eric Larson can talk to you about anarchism with a small a, right? A peaceful micro culture, micro community, as Eric mentioned. But I want to play a short clip from Miller talking about this.
The country really is going to hell, in my opinion, don't you know? And going rapidly. Now I think many people now see that, don't you know? We see, even in the early days, in the midst of relative calm and prosperity, I saw the worm in the apple, like, you know, in this country. The wrong slant toward life, I think, that's all. Materialism, the scientific trend, the importance of the business world, the domination of that world over everything, the lack of aesthetics, you see.
How things have changed, right? Or not. And it's that last part there where he juxtaposes the business world, the political world, domination, with the idea of the aesthetic. And I want to think of that, maybe not small a, but capital A. He focuses and bristles against this system of we might call political surveillance, bodily surveillance, whether it's writ large at the national level, whether it's at the familial level, the community level. And throughout his oeuvre, from his early works, Moloch, which Mary Dearborn, resurrected, so we could see all the way through, obviously, the air-conditioned nightmare and most of his major works. So I want to focus on someone who was very adept at looking at power, and that's Michel Foucault, but not perhaps the books that we're most familiar with. Some of his later lectures, he started talking about this idea of technologies of the self, and sometimes he would refer to this as self-care, and he's juxtaposing this with technologies of oppression, technologies of governmentality. And so as Foucault develops this, he really suggests that the way to overcome those instruments of governmentality, technologies of governmentality, is to take care of oneself. And he, obviously in Foucault's way, he goes all the way back and in very, very minute detail discusses how this shifts over time from the Greek period to the early Christian period, in which governments start to take the idea of the self and equate it and try to align it with their own particular views, their own particular power structures. And so the idea of self-reflection starts to be connected with ideas such as frugality or piousness and so forth. And so what Foucault says is that we start to self-regulate, we start to control ourselves, censor ourselves, behave in ways that align with state goals, state ideals, in a way that is contrary perhaps to our authentic selves. And we can see this playing out quite obviously even on university campuses, where people are starting to self-censor themselves because of various state laws, because of the threat of state laws, the threat of a student picking up a phone and recording something and then taking it out of context and so forth. And so what I see is Miller using the idea of the humanities and writ large, so not simply writing, but also painting, also music, the burlesque, all these different modalities that interested him as a perhaps type of self-care. And we see in the quotation up there from Klaus Brun Jensen, innovative or transgressive potential of artworks that articulate their message in the interstices between two or more media forms. And so this is a kind of one of the many definitions of intermediality that we can see perhaps being applicable to Miller. So we see, this is a quotation from Sexus: "The world would only begin to get something of value of me the moment I stopped being a serious member of society and became myself. The state, the nation, the United Nations of the world were nothing but one great aggregation of individuals who repeated the mistakes of their forefathers. The men who were most in life, who were molding life, who were life itself, recognized only one kind of activity, creation." And so we can see here, through a certain lens, we can see this as particularly elitist, and Miller would often pose the artist as this elite individual, this person above the others, above the masses. But from a different perspective, we can see this as a way in to perhaps challenging some of those ideologies to create our better selves, what he called the potential being in the world of sex, for example. We can see in this quotation echoes of Emerson, I think, particularly in Self-Reliance, where he talks about the institution as being the lengthened shadow of one man. Pardon the sexist terminology of Emerson there. But in other words, the institutions, the organizations that entrench themselves really begin from this creative person, whether that person is creating art, whether that person is creating some kind of belief system, that they're being true to themselves, right? And Miller suggests here, right, as he's trying to adhere to, the 9 to 5 and, making a living, doing things he doesn't particularly care to do, to put a roof over his head, to clothe himself, all those sort of basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He's essentially dying inside, right? The suggestion here, this aggregation of individuals, that we have the power to change this, much like Thoreau had said, and Emerson had said, and Whitman had said. So we see this transcendental line coming through. Earlier today, I think multiple times today, we heard the famous inhuman quotation. Arthur mentioned it at the very least. And so we might see this, right, as another version of that. Okay. So these next two slides, I focus on a couple of individuals who articulate this creative spirit and how creation can transform not only yourself, but also the society around you. Now, I picked Rank, Nietzsche, Farr, and Goldman, but I could just have easily have picked four others beyond that. He was very attracted to this type of thinking, and we see it pervade his essays, pervade his references in his autobiographical romances as well. But in both cases here, we get this sense of self-creation through art, right? Only as a genius in the act of creation merges with the primal architect of the cosmos can he truly know something of the eternal essence of art. So this idea, and a very transcendental one, I would argue from Nietzsche, this idea that you're tapping in to something larger than yourself in that act of self-creation. And two more quotations that very much reflect the kind of ideas that attracted him in terms of the use of art and the use of humanities as a bulwark against this oppression from outside sources and this lack of authenticity. Goldman, in particular here, focuses on this idea of the arts as a way to challenge the status quo. And for Goldman, she saw art as a stronger way to challenge this than haranguing someone from a soapbox, for example, or creating a counter system. Eric just mentioned this idea, pushing back against those systems and creating, a community, in this case, of artists. But I have Miller kind of glossing this. He says, the artist is obsessed with the idea of recreating the world in order to reestablish man's innocence. This innocence, he knows, is achieved only through freedom. It is based primarily on the idea of liberation through one's efforts. And I had this quotation down, and then Carolyn Blinder said this morning about Miller kind of pushing against this reliance on the centrality of the confessional voice, right? This idea that he's only in it for himself, that it's solipsistic. That quotation, which was from The World of Sex, suggests that no, there is perhaps a larger purpose to this in being true to yourself, right? So it's not a matter of you're creating art to create art. It's not even a matter of creating art to help only yourselves. But if we're all pursuing that path, right? Again, a very Emersonian idea, that's how change happens, right? So this idea that we're powerless in the system. Now, he will ultimately say that this is not an easy option, right? It's not an easy option, but it is an option. Okay. So going back to this idea of intermediality, it was stunning when I was preparing for this and writing a larger version of this, just how many references to other arts there are in Miller's work. And just pick a page at random, you're more likely than not to find such. And this is just a random or semi-random page from Tropic of Capricorn, and you can see all the highlighted sections. I was planning on having another slide that had, maybe 32 tiny little pages from the same book right next to each other. Ran out of time in terms of that, but trust me, once you start looking, they are there. And it's not just other writers. It's all sorts of artists. It's all sorts of art. It's teeming with them, no matter what he's talking about, which is the interesting thing here. He can be talking about taking a walk. He can be talking about some kind of sexual conquest. He can be talking about, just a friend he knew. There's all of these references. And this particular type of reference is very familiar to us who have studied Miller. He wears his influences on his sleeve, or at least mainly on his sleeve. And many of you in this room have commented on those references. But there's a different type of intermedial reference. And that is what Jorgen Brun and Irina Rajewski call transformational intermediality. And this is when, rather than simply name drop or drop a reference to playing the piano or a reference to a sculpture or a painting, we actually start to attempt to what Brun calls mime the formal attributes of another mediality. Rajewski says a given media product cannot use or generally reproduce elements or structures of a different medial system through its own media-specific means. It can only evoke or imitate them. And again, many people in this room have done that kind of work. Where's Sarah? On ekphrasis, for example, and many people have seen this, but it's embedded in his prose style, whether it's drawing from art, whether it's drawing from film, whether it's drawing from music. Some of these passages are particularly famous, and some are less so. The one from Tropic of Cancer, very, very famous passage from Cancer, where he is at a concert, and we get the interplay of language trying to mirror or mimic this idea of music, right? And again, we can't hear those words, but he's trying to mime them. The passage from Sexus, on the other hand, is miming the idea of burlesque dance. And so obviously these are gigantic quotations, but I wanted to have enough there so that you could at least get a taste of what he's doing to try to create this world. He does this in, The Angel is My Watermark, Scenario, Into the Nightlife, Jabberwock, Kronstadt, Cosmological Eye, and many, many other places. Those are some of the more famous ones. But these spots, and they're often these marked passages, right? These reveries, they're often that kind of prose, this sort of ecstatic, life-affirming, vital types of passages. And there's a critic, Jasna Bazkova, and she's speaking of Mina Loy in a similar context here. And she says, in order to avoid the inevitable transformation of aesthetic searches into dogmas or dead-end ideologies, one must perpetually travel between different aesthetics and change aesthetic key. And so I see this as part of that use of the humanities, part of that pattern for Miller is this key changing, getting a new notebook and writing in it, right? A few people talked earlier about revising, right? Revising not the work itself, but revising the person, right? Not stagnating. So elsewhere I've talked about this idea of conversion and the artist transforming the world. But Miller on Thoreau says, as individuals, as men, it is never too late to change. Okay? And a longer quote, but I'll just say a bit. One does not become an artist overnight, but there's pain, there's suffering in the meantime, right? It's not something that just happens, snap, there you are. It's a conscious choice, though, is what he's saying. And it's the humanities that help him get there, right? Have the famous quotation from Thoreau about, only one in 100 million being enough to have a poetic or divine life, right? And we see the quotation from Miller, but a different quotation. It is the artist who has the courage to go against the crowd. And I had all this other stuff on the attack against the humanities in the academy, which has been going on for decades and decades. But I'm out of time.